Hey, it's producer Scott, and this is the Neutral Cider Hotel podcast. Now, stop 3 on my tour through English cider country still has me in Herefordshire, but this time with the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Tom Oliver. Heralded as one of the greatest cider makers in the world, it was an absolute pleasure to spend the day with him. While I was there, he showed me around his cidery and talked about his humble beginnings. And once the recorder started, we dove deep into his love for cider and his frustration with the new cider tax scheme in the UK. I also had to know more about his incredible second career as a tour manager for the Proclaimers, Everything But the Girl, Van Morrison, and so many more amazing bands, as well as his undying affection for American football and his favorite team, the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's an absolutely fascinating conversation with an incredibly wise and brilliant human. So here we go. It's Mr. Tom Oliver on the Neutral Cider Hotel podcast. Special check-in episode. Here I am on the tour. It's producer Scott, by the way, on my tour through Hereford. Came here for Gabe's wedding, hung out on the Ross-on-Wye farm where that was held, and then went to lovely James and Susanna at Little Pomona. And then they dropped me off here with one of the preeminent, if not the cider makers in all the land, Mr. Tom Oliver of Oliver Cider. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Scott. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's been such a lovely experience being here. And, I heard so much about you being an American who knew nothing about cider through all the guys. And it's such a pleasure to actually sit down and talk to you and get to kind of know your background. And I thought you had talked to me a little bit about what brought you to cider. And I'd never heard that on our show or seen it in anything. So I thought it would be interesting to start off by, maybe sharing some of that story, because in my mind, if you're the guy, you've been doing it your whole life and you were just cider out of the womb. Right. That's not quite the case.
No, it's really not quite the case. I always feel in a way that I am still the new boy on the block. Certainly in Herefordshire parlance, obviously Boomers and Westerns being the sizable companies they were here long before I was. And both Mike Johnson at Ross-on-Wye and Dennis Gwatkin at Gwatkin Cider had been making cider for a year or two before I even considered making cider, which is why I consider myself still to be almost the new kid on the block. But there are a lot more new kids on the block coming after me now, which is why cider, I think, is an exciting category and in a really sort of vibrant condition. What got me into cider? The fact that I really felt that the ciders that were around when I was in my sort of what I would call my big consumption phase were good, but they weren't as great as I thought they could be. That cider just seemed to be content with taking a sort of, average road, a middle of the road, whatever it was. There was nothing that was just wonderfully exemplary. But there were people and makers who were hinting at that. And also there were the advocates that were making at home and giving you the idea that cider was potentially capable of delivering much more in taste and flavor. So Kevin Minshew, who is a cider and perry maker I know that Gabe has mentioned, really did allow me to see the benefits of understanding the fruit and working with the fruit. And he was quite an inspiration. And then the two other chaps who what I call more the old boys. One was a chap called Ted Jones, and he lived just outside Bromyard. He was a cider maker, and he understood the merits of individual varieties, and that was very exciting. And he also was one of the few farmhouse cider makers who understood wine to a degree, certainly country wine, and had an approach that mirrored a knowledge in that. But I think the main thrust came for me from a gentleman called Roger French. And Roger had written a book on cider in the 1980s called The History and Virtue of Cider, at a time when he was literally crying in the wilderness and nobody was listening. Nobody wanted to know. He wrote this wonderful book that talked about the humors and the champagne method and the real potential that farmhouse cider had. And he had built a cellar underneath his kitchen, and this cellar used to flood. So if he ever went down into the cellar to fetch a bottle of cider, he would wear his Wellingtons, and he would also take a torch, because if you turned the light on down there, you ran the risk of standing in water and possible either electrocution or at least fusing the electric circuit in the house. And he'd come back up with these bottles, and they were all of a wonderful sort of hint at what cider could be, until one day he emerged with a bottle that was sort of rusted top, and it had like written on a hand label Kingston Black. And he came up and opened it up. It had a really satisfying pop to it, and like a shh as he poured it. And then the aroma was just like everything I want from a cider, full of spice and full of fruit, and just promising so much. The taste delivered more than almost the aroma could promise. It was just a sensational drink. And it was at that moment I just went, okay, so this is what you can do with cider apples and making cider. I made cider with Roger for a few years. After that, I even bought an orchard off him, which I have recently sold on because I've been a terrible orchardist. But yeah, all those things that I've rambled on about all came to play a part in kicking me into making cider to sell, because that's what it's all about.
And up until that point, you were kind of on a music path.
Yep, that's fair to say. My dad had said when I was 21, there's not enough work on the farm for all of you, pointing at his 4 children. And if anyone wants to or thinks they're capable of earning a living outside of this, I suggest you sort of get on with it. For once, I listened to my father, and eventually, though it didn't fall into place, nothing good falls into place immediately, does it? You've got to work for it, and you've got to strive for it. But yeah, I got a good feel for tour managing and for mixing sound, and that's what I ended up doing with a wonderful selection of different outfits.
And so and let's just do a little name check on some of these outfits, because it's not like these tiny local bands that nobody's ever heard of. Talk about some of the artists you did tour managing for.
Yeah, so I mean, I have had the opportunity to work with a great variety, and we can talk about Everything But the Girl. We can talk about Van Morrison. We can talk about the Proclaimers. We can talk in terms of mixing sound about some of the great reggae guys like Gregory Isaacs and Burning Spear. You could talk about some prog rock maestros like It Bites, and there is actually a whole host of other ones too. It's in terms of audio, it's a varied and colourful panorama of sound that I've had to work with. And in terms of tour managing, the same thing. Done some lovely tours, seen some interesting sights along the way. and my lips are sealed.
Of course. I knew I was going to pry any good stories out of you. But, I mean, to that end, I know that once you get bit by the music bug, it's kind of always there. And even though you're running a cidery, you still find some time occasionally to pop back in. Didn't you just tour manage the Proclaimers on a recent tour?
Yep. I've never stepped back from the road in terms of the Proclaimers. Always been up for it and available. Actually missed my first ever tour with them down in Australia and New Zealand at the beginning of this year because it conflicted with lambing. We usually go after I finish lambing, but this year they had to go while I was lambing, so I didn't manage to get on that tour. But other than that, I've done every tour they've done in the last 38 years, which is
incredible.
Which is almost a lifetime.
Yeah, I'll say. And for those of us who are not country bumpkins and don't know what lambing is, you want to just...
Yeah, so lambing is the period of the year, usually in the spring in England, when the sheep, the female adult sheep, the ewes, give birth to their young, the lambs, and you are there on hand to help if needed in a sort of midwifery vein, and hopefully all it is just keeping an eye on things, but rarely is the path true. A sheep, the phrase is sheep are born to die, and they do their absolute best to fill that.
And that's a good point in that you have a working farm in addition to the cidery.
Yes. So that's mostly focused around growing grass to feed beef cattle and sheep for fat lamb. And historically, we'd grown hops for inputting into beer. But that all stopped at the end of the 1900s, about 1998.
Way back in the 1900s. Seems like a long time ago, doesn't it?
It is.
So let's turn our attention a little bit to cider. We haven't spoken for the podcast to you in at least a year and a half or so. I mean, I'm basing this on the age of Gabe's child, so we'll just kind of clock it right to that. Yeah. But obviously, we did this through the pandemic. A lot of cider makers, some were struggling, but some were finding a lot of opportunity during the pandemic and seeing a bit of a lift. And I wonder, since then, last year and a half or so, how has it been going for you and your cidery?
Okay. We have definitely had the double whammy effect for us of prior to COVID was Brexit, and then COVID has had a big effect on us. The big plus we have is the massive flexibility as a small business that you can change almost overnight. And so if one particular form of packaging becomes redundant, but another one, it becomes the one to go to, we can pretty much facilitate that and get round to it. But I would say that the most significant thing is the growth and, the arrival on the scene, and then the growth of fine cider under the guidance of Felix. That has made a massive difference to us in terms of distribution. And I would be remiss not to mention Alice at the Real Ale Company and George and Adam up at Hard Press Cider in Scotland. They're the three people that we use for distribution. We just don't make enough to think about having any other distributors. So they've managed to navigate the precarious situation at home. Unfortunately, export, which was incredibly important to us, and in terms of volume, it was important to us, but just in terms of profile and spreading the word, it was incredibly important. That took a massive hit. We're just climbing back out of that and reestablishing it. The upshot is that export volumes have suffered a lot in the last 5 years, but we really are hopeful that we're starting to see it recover. And that's down to the belief of usually individual people who wish to import our cider into their bar, their restaurant, or for their distributorship. And I'm obviously very, very grateful for them and for the belief that they have in cider and the potential for cider. And that's growing. There's a strong, I think, emerging belief in cider coming from the more eastern part of Europe. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some very exciting cider being made there, and that's going to complement the ciders being made in America, going to complement the ciders made in the traditional areas, France, Spain, England, and they're everywhere. Cider makers are popping up now. We're starting to populate the world with cider makers making cider locally. And when that starts to happen and starts to move, I think, the availability of cider general is going to improve. And then who knows, we might suddenly find cider becomes a little more available and a little more appreciated.
And to be clear, with all my whining about having a hard time finding your cider in San Diego or the West Coast, there is pockets of your cider out there. We know Sam at Anxo, that's ANXO, started bringing it in and actually posting it on his online store. So for anyone listening who always says, well, I've heard so much about Oliver's and Tom's cider, and I really want to try it. That's a good, if you can't find it in your local bottle shop, that's a good place to go.
It really is. And it's great that the efforts of one person and one organization can actually bring your cider in potentially in front of lots and lots of people. And that's, I'm very grateful to Sam for that. And hopefully it all plays into how he sees his cider, because Anxo made a fantastic range of dry ciders. And there's that belief in that potential, which is, I think, where we're all slowly pushing it, hopefully.
Yeah. So, I spent some time with James and Susanna over at Little Pomona. I spent some time on Ross on Wye and was sampling a lot of ciders. And, it just feels so distinct from the stuff I taste in America. But I also felt like I could see, two, and knowing yours now, 3 clear paths of just, it's kind of like the rising tides lifts all boats type of thing. Like you guys all found your lane. You're all doing cider, but you're all doing it in your own spin. And I was wondering if you had a way to articulate kind of your vision for cider and what sets you apart from other ciders.
I think if I'm pushed, what I see being the Oliver's sort of trademark or USP or whatever we would say, we make cider based on taste, and taste involves the application of our interpretation of how we can get the best out of the ciders that we make and how we blend them, how we replicate those blends in a vintage sense, and how we see balance, how we see the way you can manipulate the sense of balance by replacing true acidity with carbonation, and the effect of carbonation in terms of mouthfeel, how the way you can utilize sweetness and tannin and use sweetness to ameliorate tannin and make it more acceptable, or put it into a situation where the balance between sweetness, acidity, and tannin is maybe technically not precise, but in terms of the mouthfeel and the way that you enjoy the cider, it's completely acceptable. So we work on that basis. We probably use the same fruit as the other makers that we're talking about, but the fruit is probably growing in different locations. But in essence, we're using fruit that most people would say is an acceptable fruit for making cider, and that's a great gift. I don't say you can't make cider from all apples. Of course you can, but I've long believed that if an apple has gained a reputation, it's usually for a reason, and that reason is, if it's for making cider, is that it makes good cider. And I don't wish to do anything other than make great cider with those great apples.
And for all you budding cider makers out there, you're self-taught. You didn't study this on any grand scale or go to school for this. This is all something that you picked up.
I am self-taught, though I will be the first to hold my hand up and say that I have been on every Peter Mitchell course available, and I'm a massive fan of the benefit of the education that he can provide. I fear that I am probably not one of his best students. I'm sure he'd be quite happy to agree with me on that. But I have taken to heart his words. I understand so much more about the chemistry and science behind cider. And my cider making has benefited from knowing how close to the edge I go, how ridiculous some of my sort of thought out scientific processes are in my head. I mean, they bear no relationship to science, whatever. It's just that I'm lucky that the pathway certain certain yeast sugar combinations follow give me something that I can work with. But my goodness, my understanding of that pathway is very poor. So knowledge is king, but whether you choose to use it or not is down to you and how you see your approach to cider making. So I'm very much based on farmhouse cider. It's the pressing of freshly picked fruit and fruit specifically grown for cider, pressing it spontaneously, fermentation through the yeasts in the building and on the equipment and in and on the fruit, and then that period of fermentation and maturation through the winter, and then the tasting and blending and packaging of cider into the spring and summer of the next year, and then the approach we use for some vintage blending from previous years, etc., etc., all done on taste and our perception in the mouth of balance. And also hopefully some good imagination, coming up with things that keep pushing the boundaries of everything. Ultimately, we just want to make cider that people want to drink. I don't want them to study it particularly. I don't want them to write reams and reams about it. I just want them to be sat down with their friends and they're having a conversation and they open up a cider made by Oliver's, and that conversation keeps flowing. It's not interrupted. It doesn't need to break down to stare at admiration about the ingredients in it. It's apples. It's a great cider. It fuels the conversation. It's a social lubricant, and everyone has a great time.
Have you ever made one that people didn't want to drink?
Yeah. I've made plenty I don't want to drink. It's what you do with them that's the key to it. There's no doubt that out of our range of ciders through any period of time over years, it's probably hundreds of different ciders we've made. And no one person is going to enjoy all your ciders, even if they, differentiate in terms of, I like a sweeter, fruitier one. No, I like a drier, earthier one, or whatever. But there's so many factors that come into why you like a cider and why you don't like a cider. The only thing would try and pretend is that we think all the ciders we make are good in their own right.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a matter of finding the ones that you like. But just because you don't like something doesn't mean it's a bad cider.
Yep. But I'd love to know one of those stinkers.
Yeah.
I know. I'll let you off the hook again. So I would love to know from you, since you're so plugged in. You go to shows, you go to festivals, you obviously do this, and you're kind of held high in esteem in this space. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing cider in the next couple of years? I know the tax scheme here in the UK has obviously created a lot of mess. Talk about that and any other thing you see as some of the challenges facing cider.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge really facing cider in terms of the smaller, more niche focused stroke craft, stroke farmhouse, whatever it is that general impression that I'm getting now that I'm spending more and more time at the computer filling in paperwork for not for sending out invoices or checking that you've been paid or paying for things that you've bought, etc., but fulfilling VAT, fulfilling duty, fulfilling export paperwork, fulfilling all the other sort of HACCPs and this and that and the other. An extraordinary amount of time, far more time doing that added together than I spend making cider. And I totally begrudge that. I am here, the skill I have, if I have a skill, is to make cider. It is not doing paperwork and everything. But these businesses that we have, small businesses, we can't employ people to do each individual thing. The onerous paperwork for small businesses is a real problem. And then the arrival of a new duty taxation system that certainly hasn't been sat down with a small cider maker to see how it will affect him or how he'll even start to fill in a return on a monthly basis is, to me, it just shows a total and utter disrespect for what we do and our skills and abilities by government and by the relevant departments. It is extraordinary. They take thousands of pounds from us on a monthly basis, and they are making our life harder and harder. I find it disrespectful and ingenuous, and I begrudge them it. But there we go. That's what we've got to do. It's a hurdle. We're pretty resilient, us cider makers. You don't come into cider if you aren't. As long as we can see the pleasure that cider gives, the pleasure it gives us in making it, and the fact that we are always, like any great songwriter or anything, we're really only interested in the next great cider that we're going to make and sell. And that's what spurs us on. So my hope is that we dump all that mess, get a clear vision that making the best quality cider we can in a growing quantity so that more people can find it and get hold of it, and that around the world more and more people take to making cider, which is what I see. The caliber of people that I meet now, and especially coming out of America, is just fantastic. And I'm so excited by this upward trend in numbers. It is moving and we're going somewhere. I don't give a monkeys about wine. I don't give a monkeys about beer. What I just need is more people to have the chance to try good cider, because for some people it is the drink they didn't know existed, and it's the drink for them. If I don't want to try and pull people away from red wine by eulogizing the virtues of like a good tannic cider. If they can't taste it, then they're lost. It's a great drink in its own right. Drink it and give it the chance that it deserves. And yeah, we're there.
Agreed. I'd be remiss. Oh, by the way, Gabe's going to be so happy I asked you about that tax question. He's going to jump out of his shorts. So I'd be remiss if I didn't make sure, because I think we talked about this offline, but I don't think we did it on the podcast. But, we have a lot of Americans who listen to this podcast, and they may or may not know that you are a huge American football fan.
Oh, yes.
And I wanted you to first kind of share the story of how you found your team, and then talk to me about their outlook for this year.
Well, as with everything, you sort of come to things through a variety of inputs. But I remember, for me, the first real impression that football made on me was we tour in America in a musical sense, and you'd have driven all night, and you'd pull into some motel or hotel in the early hours, 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, and you'd sort of be half wired and buzzing from the drive. So you needed to just put the telly on, and it'd be Sportsnet or Sports Center or whatever it was. And frequently, I remember just seeing this wonderful poetic motion of a spiral football going through the air, and these guys running away from it, and then they wouldn't even turn around to look at the ball, but they just put up their two hands, and this ball would land in their hands, and in they go for a touchdown. And this was so unlike anything I'd seen with rugby in the UK, which I played, and I absolutely was spellbound by it, the precision of it, and then this wonderful, wonderful game that they created that lasted 3 hours, but in actual fact only ran for like 60 minutes, but it was all interspersed with massive amounts of advertisements, of course. But in that gap, you fulfill it with statistics of just mind-boggling and mind-numbing irrelevance and irreverence sometimes, but just how the heck can you create this? But they've created this extraordinary industry around a pigskin. But there is some wonderful poetry in that pigskin. I understand a little more now about why some people don't like American football. It has connotations and everything for them, this, that, and the other. But I still maintain a love for it. I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, and we've got Kenny Pickett, we got Pickens as wide receiver, we've got Freiermuth at tight end. We've got a couple of running backs, Najee Harris now, and the new guy on the block. Smaller chap, I can't remember his name. Anyway, we've got a lot of talent and everything. Our biggest asset, Mike Tomlin, some coach, some approach to coaching, and a man who seems to get the best out of everyone and keep everybody happy. Quite a unique ability in terms of football. So full of hope for this season. I'm particularly excited because we're going to go and see at Tottenham Hotspur Football Ground in October the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Buffalo Bills. And as Pat McAfee would say, are the Beals going to do it this year? It's the team everyone's push saying they should be like Super Bowl bound, but I just don't want to even do that to them. They're a really entertaining football team. They play great hard football. May they keep doing that. And I'm sure they're an opponent that nobody ever wants to meet. But Steelers. I think it's going to be a good year. But everyone says that during the preseason.
Of course they do. I mean, I have to say, there's nothing that warms my American heart more than you saying we are going to have a good season. That means you're a homer through and through. You love the home team and you feel like you're part of it. So that's amazing. And the fact that you love the game so much that you even listen to podcasts, sports podcasts about the game and the players.
The Pat McAfee show is my day-to-day 3-hour podcast. I mean, utter drivel sometimes, but utter brilliance at other times. And a man there who has created a punter from the Indianapolis Colts, who's created this podcast and who is now is going to go and be distributed, as it were, through ESPN. And, his diehard fans are shouting that he's sold out to ESPN. And what he's done is just really secure the future of him and his merry band of like half a dozen guys who he's went to school with and who they've stuck together, created this podcast and this unit. It's just extraordinary. For me, it's like heartwarming in this brutal world we live in that he's championing his friends and bringing out the talents that they have. They've just managed to bring back Gumpy from Victoria in Canada. He'd been something like 400 days in exile because he hadn't had the correct paperwork, and I think he'd been deported. But they just championed him coming back. So Pat McAfee show, and I have to tell you this, that for me, in those moments when you might stand near a great artist, one of the great moments for me was getting in within about 8 feet of Joe Montana. Wow. I mean, like, I was fantastic. He was the man. He still is the man. Gentleman Joe. I've got so that was a big moment for me.
Amazing. Well, let me just say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for taking the time. You've been a gracious host, and I've really enjoyed seeing your cidery, spending some time with you, and of course, we're all big fans of you on the show, and so happy you took some time for us today. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Scott, very much for visiting, and I'm amazed how little of my cider I have forced you to drink.
Oh,
but
please,
there we go.
I've been begging for it the whole time. So thank you, Tom. I appreciate it.